today's lesson, we're going to look at how to get started adding single note melody lines to your rhythm guitar playing. We'll look at some of the techniques and fundamentals that will help you add depth and movement to your rhythm guitar parts. Plus, we'll discuss some of the popular ways to map out and learn the fretboard. My name is Jack Ruch. Welcome to my channel. Let's get into it. So the examples we're going to cover today are all about combining rhythm guitar playing with very simple single note melody lines. And this is a great way to add some color to your rhythm guitar parts. But it does require a little bit of fundamentals, mainly triads, chord inversions, and some very simple scale patterns. But one of the things you'll notice as we work through this stuff is that all these things are inherently connected. To start out, I'm going to play an example in the key of G using some very basic open position chords and connecting them together with notes out of the G major scale. I'll put the chords up on the screen as we go. So let's dive into this. Now this first example uses these very basic open position chords, right? The chords are G major to C major, back to G major, and then to D major. And then in the B section it goes to an E minor, to C major, and then E minor, to D major, then E minor, C major, and then finally A minor to D major. So all of these chords are diatonic chords that live within the key of G major. So in order to connect these chords together melodically, all we really need to know is our G major scale. And what's great about playing in this open position is that we're already playing all these chord voicings in one spot on the fretboard. So we can learn the scale pattern that fits in this position and we can start to connect it together. So the G major scale in this spot on the neck is like this. Right? And one of the things I love to do with these big open position chords, especially when you're playing on an electric guitar or playing with other musicians, is to break them down into smaller pieces, mainly triads. Now a triad is the root, third, and fifth of the chord, right? That's the first, third, and fifth note of the major scale, the G major scale in this case. So if we look at this big open position chord right here, if we take the first three notes, there is a G major triad right there, root, third, fifth. And then if we keep moving up, we have the first inversion of that triad, which is third, fifth, root. And then as we move up the strings, then we get the fifth, root, and third. So the second inversion of that triad. So right there, we've got three triad shapes that live right within this chord. And these are great for playing smaller, more musical portions of the chord voicing, right? Sometimes it's nice to play a big G major chord like that, but sometimes you only need to play just a small portion of it, and especially when you're connecting it together with single note lines. right? Little things like that taken from the G major scale. Now the cool thing is we can do this with all the chords in this position. If we move to this C major chord, again, right here we've got root, third, fifth of C. And then the first inversion, third, fifth, root. And then we have fifth, root, third. So right there in that position, we've got these three triad shapes. And we can even go down and have that inversion too below. So we've got all these triads right here, which are great useful tools for really learning that chord all over the fretboard. And this is something I've discussed a lot on this channel and in my triad course. But things like this are great for connecting these two chords together. If I just play those three notes of G major to those three notes of C major, and then I can connect that together with notes out of that G major scale. So, right, anything like that. Right, little things like that. So our D major voicing in this position would be like this basic kind of D major chord. And I like to play this with the F sharp, this third in the bass. Right, I'll play it. You can play it with the thumb like that, or you can play it like that. So, you know, this voicing right here, you've got a D major triad. That's first inversion with the third in the bass, then the fifth, and then the root, right? Or you have this triad shape, which is fifth, root, third. So you've got these different triads in this position. And so in the beginning of that example, I played G, and then I kind of played a line using some open strings out of the G major scale. And then came down to this C major triad. And then from here I played, right again, falling down to that triad. And that's just, I did that little half step trill in there just to give it a little, you know, a little nuance, a nice little inflection. And then I repeated that same thing down to the third of that D major chord. And then going into the second part of the A section, I went, again, just right up the major scale, 3, 4, 5, right? The third, the fourth, up to the perfect fifth. And then hit that big open position chord, right? And then back to that triad, and then, right, again, just moving down the scale to the root of that G chord, that open G string, and then, right, moving right through the scale and just targeting key notes of the chords as we go. Then as we move to the B section, to E minor, I'm just playing right out of this E minor shape, but again, it's all out of the G major scale because all these chords are diatonic to that key. So, right, again, just targeting these chord tones, targeting these triad shapes and these larger chord shapes. So all of this stuff is connected together. The triads are within the larger chord voicings, and they all belong within the key of G major. So all these notes of G major can be used to connect all these things together. So they're all just elements of one larger picture. Going back to the E minor from the C, I played moving back to the third of our D chord. And then the second time around, the same thing again. A slight variation on that G major thing going to the C chord, and then right up to this A minor chord. Again, just playing right out of this A minor triad here. And then playing up the G major scale and targeting notes of this D major triad. And then, right, again, just using some nice open string things out of that G major scale. So now that we've discussed this basic open position, use of these chords, let's move it up the fretboard and let's talk a little bit about the cage system. Now, the cage system is really just a way of mapping things out on the fretboard using these open chord shapes but moving them up through different positions on the fretboard. And one of the things about the cage system is that it's inherently connected with all these triad shapes and these different scale patterns. And it can be a great way to kind of visually see these things mapped out around the fretboard. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to play a very similar example, but I'm going to move that whole thing up to the key of C. So instead of my root note here on the 3rd fret of the E string for G, my root note is now going to be up here on the, the 8th fret of the E string. And that's my root for this C chord voicing, right? This is like a G shape, just like this, but moved up. And I'm going to use these same chord shapes, right? There's my C shape moved up. There's my D shape moved up, right? So now we have C, F, and G, right? And then we're going to go A minor to C, A minor to G, and then A minor to C, and then D minor to G, right? So same chord relationship, right? It's the same relationship of chords, but moved to a different key. And we're going to use the exact same shapes and positions. We're going to use the same scale shape. This time it's going to be a C major scale starting here, and it's going to go. Right? And we're going to have the same triads, right? Our C major triad and all its inversions, right? Our F major triad is right here. And then we have our G major triad right there and right there. So I'm going to play a very similar example but moved up the fretboard, and this will start to demonstrate a little bit about what the cage system is and how we can move these triads and scale patterns around the fretboard. Alright, so we start this example off playing this C major triad right here, which again is, the same thing as we played down here for G. It's our open strings, right? But now we're just move that whole thing up here around this C chord. So I'm playing, right, the exact same thing we played down here. But just moving it up. It's almost as if you just put a capo up here and played the exact same thing. But instead of using a capo, we're just using our fingers and visually seeing it in a different spot of the neck. right? But by understanding how these chords connect together and where they are visually on the fretboard, and then understanding that there's these triad shapes within these chords, these smaller little fragments that we can use. Things like that, right? There's a nice C major triad, right? And that moves perfectly to this F major triad. And all of these little notes that I'm using to connect them together are all right out of this C major pattern. Right? And all the notes in these chords are all within that scale too. So you can literally pick and choose how you want to tie these things together. If I just want to go from C to F, I can take any of the notes from this scale, right? I could go, right? Or I could go, or I could go. Anything I want to do. Right? Anything that works melodically, and you can experiment with that and pick and choose different things that work for you. So all the tabs for this are going to be up on my Patreon site, and you can work through these types of things on your own. I'll also put this backing track up there so you can experiment with moving this around. And this is really just kind of dipping your toe in the water of this whole cage thing, because there's so many more ways you can use this in different positions and different chord shapes you can utilize. But this is essentially what's going on when people talk about the cage system or triad groupings or scale patterns across the neck. It's honestly pretty simple when you think about it in terms of these basic open chords, right? It's all this stuff. It's just moved around the fretboard. And it takes time to kind of work through it all and get comfortable with connecting the chords together with notes out of the major scale. But it's not a very difficult concept to wrap your mind around. It's just something that takes some practice. All right, I hope this lesson was helpful for you. As always, go check out my Patreon page for tabs and backing tracks for this lesson and all my other lessons here on YouTube. Until next time, happy practicing and take care.